Hello, welcome to our second session in our new series, What's Next? New Ways of Engaging Jewish Sources. We're delighted that you can join us today. And throughout this series, we're going to hear from our very talented faculty, and they're going to be highlighting ways in which they are using our textual tradition to change and expand our audiences and engage people in new and different ways, in new and different vehicles. And so today I'm really excited because this is a program that's been, I think, launched in the last couple of years. We have a master's in clinical care and counseling, and this is a highly flexible program that is remote and people can take from all over. And it also encourages interfaith engagement in this, that it is not a strictly Jewish cohort, that we have people from all backgrounds who are looking to become chaplains or, find a master's in spiritual care and counseling that are taking this on. So we are having the head of this program, Rabbi Naomi Kalish, talk about the master's today. But more than talking about the master's, she's going to really highlight the type of learning that is central to this program, which is going to be the pillar of what we're doing throughout this series. Thank you for coming. Thanks to anybody who's new today. We're delighted to have you. We've been doing these series for almost 5 years. And I want to thank you all for donating to support programs like these. If you are so inclined, we also have sponsorship opportunities that are available. You can make a donation in honor of a loved one or in reflection of a specific anniversary. And we would you would get called out on this delightful broadcast, but also you would be supporting JTS Learning, and we so appreciate all of our donors. So today we're going to be talking to Rabbi Naomi Kalish. Her topic is fostering healing conversations, and this is going to really look at both modern medical interventions, but also textual traditions. And I think I missaid that a little. It's more on kind of modern psychology and behavioral health and the sorts of things that are very much part of a contemporary behavioral health diagnosis. But then how do we imbue that with our traditions and our texts? And she is she's an assistant professor of pastoral education, but she is also the Harold and Carol Wolf director of the Center for Pastoral Education. She's taught clinical pastoral education at New York Presbyterian and was on the interprofessional education faculty at Columbia University Medical Center, among many other places. And she's really expanded the reach of our Center for Pastoral Education. We're going to have time for Q&A. You're going to send your questions to me, and then I'll ask them to Rabbi Kalish. For technical questions, please chat my colleague, Aidan Fisher-Brown. Thank you so much, Aidan, for being here today to help us out. And you should have received an email before with Rabbi Kalish's sources. We'll be sharing those in the screen, but you'll also see a link to those sources in our chat. So without further ado, that was very quick, and I apologize if it was too quick, but I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Kalish to get into this conversation on fostering healing conversations.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone who has joined this conversation for today, and welcome from whatever location you're in and whatever time zone you're in. It's really my pleasure to be giving this presentation on a topic that probably affects all of us, which broadly speaking is the topic of how do we support people and care for people when they go through difficult times. And it's my pleasure to talk about this topic and to link us to some sources, some ancient, some more recent, and then to also talk about how are we at JTS preparing professionals through their professional roles to show up for people during difficult times and to be supportive. So one word just about myself before I dive into our topic for today. I'm a graduate of JTS. I attended the rabbinical school and also earned a master's in Jewish philosophy. I did not know where I wanted to work as a rabbi, and then had a required internship, which I always feel like, requirements can sometimes lead to the most unexpected ways. And we sometimes have something confirmed that we want to pursue, or we have something confirmed that we don't want to pursue. And for me, the required internship in hospital chaplaincy gave me the embodied experience of sitting at the bedside with people and feeling like this is where I'm supposed to be, and this is what I think rabbis are supposed to do. Now, of course, I answered it for myself, and at that point, and of course, incredibly grateful and always say, thankfully, we all feel called and drawn and find purpose in different places, physical places and vocations. But for me, this led to a career of working 20 years in hospitals throughout New York City. And then 5.5 years ago, I got this wonderful invitation to come back to JTS and become part of the faculty and the administration. And it's a dream come true that JTS decided to launch a master's integrating the academic and what we call the clinical training in spiritual care. So during this time, I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to teach you the way we sometimes study in our classes, and I'm going to teach some texts, and then I'm also going to make some parenthetical comments throughout the conversation about how this links to our masters. And I also want to say before we dive in that in this field of study, we touch on subjects that are sometimes sad or distressing, upsetting, and this is part of the education that we do, is first just to acknowledge that these aren't theoretical conversations sometimes, and part of our training is to help people develop a deeper sense of self-awareness, since we're each unique individuals and will be touched differently by the situations that we become privy to. And we'll have different, we have different histories that we bring in, family histories, physical histories, and we have different emotional responses. And all of that is part of the training and the education. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to have us start with the source sheet. And you'll see that I have some paintings in some of the source sheets. And, the question can be asked, when does spiritual care, or what has historically been referred to as pastoral care, like when did it begin? And there's a couple different responses to that. So on the right side, you see a painting that, by Marc Chagall, The Three Angels Visiting Abraham. And this story from the Torah of Abraham being visited is linked or associated as the first instance and the source of the mitzvah to visit people when they're ill, because these three visitors came immediately after, like the next verse, after Abraham had his circumcision. So the Talmud interprets this as an example of God visiting Abraham in his recovery. And so here we have Marc Chagall painting this. What's interesting to me is, and you'll see here, we have Abraham in blue, and behind him, we also see Sarah, who is the family member of the person who's had the physical experience. And in this story, we see both this interpretation of visiting the sick, as well as we also learn a second mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of hosting guests. And so in some ways, they're two very different kinds of mitzvot, though I often think that part of what we do when we visit people during difficult times is also look for their own sense of agency and dignity. And sometimes being able to also be a host can, for some people at some times, be what's exactly life affirming. So this is from Judaism. And if we were to look at world religions and cultures, we would see that everybody has traditions that are often like quite ancient for caring for people during difficult times and during what we could consider to be the most, some of the most universally human experiences. So not exclusively, but the issues or the experiences of illness, of decline, of aging, of dying, of bereavement. These cut across all time and all people. And so for us, this is our, for the Jewish community, this is the story, the ancient story we connect to. We could also ask ourselves, when did the profession of caring for people during difficult times emerge? And maybe refining that a little bit, when did the professions of chaplaincy and of what has been sometimes called pastoral care and counseling, now the field has largely shifted to spiritual care and counseling, when did it begin? And of course, this could be a whole other lecture. Um, but what we have on the left side here is a painting from 1618 of, in the Catholic tradition, Saint Martin. And from the story of Saint Martin, we receive the term chaplain. And so you might see he's wearing a red cloak or red cape. And he's a soldier. Martin was a soldier, and he came across a man who was poor and who was not clothed. And he took his cape, according to legend, and he sliced it in half with his sword, and he gave him half of his cape. And that night he had a religious dream, and from that he left being a soldier and he pursued the priesthood. So that's the story. But over time, this word cape that comes from his cape or his cloak became the word for chapel and chaplain, and interestingly also the word a cappella. And chaplaincy in its origin was the providing for the religious and spiritual needs of people who were too far from home to benefit from their home community or their home clergy. So in a way, kind of like this half of the piece of the cloak, chaplaincy served to serve people who were in distant or marginal or disenfranchised positions, or just geographically distant. So that's where we have the origin of the word chaplain. We'll talk a little bit more about the actual 20th, what emerged in the 20th century from chaplaincy and from spiritual care or pastoral care, Bikor Cholim. And that's what's sometimes referred to as the professional field of chaplaincy, the professional field of spiritual care and counseling. So this is a field in which people take, like other professions, they do graduate level education, training, internships. They sometimes have credentialing like certification, and belong to professional associations. And these fields of chaplaincy and the counseling came together just over 100 years ago, 1924, when the first internships were offered for seminary students to go into hospitals and provide care to people while they were hospitalized, and then to come back to a class and reflect on those experiences and ideally learn something, gain a new insight, technique, self-awareness, or theory, and then go back and try again, and over time just grow in their capacity to provide care. So in our program, which is true across the field, we try to bring together three areas of what I like to refer to as wisdom. And it's the wisdom that comes from our texts and traditions. It's the wisdom that comes from the behavioral sciences and psychology, and wisdom that comes from the stories of our own lived experience in the current day. And we bring those together to the class. So I'd like to give an example of a class experience. And so we have an example of how this might look in the classroom. So with permission from my former student, I just shared this brief story, which is she visited a woman who was hospitalized, who had had a recurrence of cancer. And she had already gone through chemotherapy extensively previously. She was in remission, and now she has a recurrence. She's back at the hospital. She's receiving chemotherapy again. So in this, what we call the clinical method or the case method of learning, she brought the story to class. And in the assignment to write up the case study, students are asked to reflect on the spiritual state of how did they understand the person spiritually. And often we refer this to like, how was their hope or despair? Were they feeling connected or isolated, lonely? What kind of meaning were they finding, or were they experiencing a brokenness of meaning? So this student responded that the woman she had met had said a few comments like, "I'm back at the hospital. I don't know if this is going to work. I don't think the chemotherapy is going to work." And then in her write-up, the student wrote she was hopeful. Well, you can imagine what the class said. Like, how did you find hopefulness when she said, "I don't think this treatment's going to work. I have a bad feeling about this." So the class discussed it, and it was very interesting. Some people were focused on the words, "I don't think this is going to work." But she, the student in this case, said, "But I was looking at her actions. She showed up. She came for treatment. I sensed a spark of hopefulness in her actions." So here you see a discussion and a grappling in the class, as well as some differences in who heard what. Of course, there isn't really a declaration of truth. There isn't something that could be measured in this case, but how we hear and how we understand the people we're caring for, that informs how we respond to them. And so the class helps through this clinical method, helps us develop those deeper sense of self-awareness and of listening skills. Okay, so here on this next page, we have a story which comes from Jewish tradition, which also raises some of these same questions. This is a story about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. There's a lot of stories about him and his students in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Father. He had a group of 5 disciples who then became students who became colleagues of him and part of his community. And so there's a whole variety of different legends associated with him. And so this is one story, and you'll see I set it up in the similar format that we do our case studies for the current day experiences students have. But here, this story lent itself also to this. And so I'll read it. So once Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was walking with his student Rabbi Joshua, near Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Joshua looked up at the temple in ruins and he said, "Whoa, this place that atoned for the sins of the people Israel lies in ruins." He, Rabbi Yochanan, said to him, "Don't be afraid, my son. There is another way of gaining atonement. Even though the temple is destroyed, and what is it? It's through deeds of loving kindness. For it is written, loving kindness I desire, not sacrifice." So sometimes when this text is studied, it's seen as coming to a place of the correct approach, like Rabbi Yehoshua, like he was grieving what wasn't, but Rabban Yochanan was there to teach him a better way forward. But with a chaplain's ears or a spiritual care ears, I hear this story and I read this story differently. What I see in it is 2 people dealing with the same situation, the same catastrophe, the same crisis, and they have 2 different emotional and spiritual responses. Rabbi Joshua says, "Whoa, like this place lies in ruins." And he's saying it's a place that atoned for our sins. So he's saying, like, how are we ever going to go forward without that place that did that, provided that visceral experience of spiritual cleansing. And he is in despair. And then we hear Rabban Yochanan, who you may know was the person who negotiated and established the yeshiva in Yavne and is, kind of rebuilt post-temple Judaism as a tradition of study. And so, but if we don't look at the content of this, but we look at the emotion, he's saying, don't be afraid. There's another way. He has a sense of a reconstructed faith. He has found meaning and hope and whatever differences there were between the temple and the yeshiva, he says, Gemilut Hasidim, acts of loving kindness, whatever differences there are, it's okay. So he has a sense of confidence. And if I can imagine like the chaplain walking into this would be one of the ways, the complexities of being with people, which is that we each have a different, unique way of responding to a situation. And that's part of what we have to navigate, in our personal lives and professional lives. What I wish is that we had a next line, but the Midrash doesn't give us a next line. I'm really curious. Did Rabbi Joshua, was he comforted by Rabban Yochanan's statement? In today's world, we'd say like, oh, he didn't validate his feelings. Well, it's not so simple. Maybe he was comforted by this, or maybe he didn't feel validated. We just don't know. But that would be, if we were reading this as a textbook, which we're not, that would be a question about the strengths and the limitations of Rabban Yochanan's response. Okay, let's continue. We're going to look now, and then we'll go into the next page. We're going to look at another story with Rabban Yochanan and his students, and this is a longer text, and I'll read through it. If we were doing this in a small group, we would have different people take different parts and read the different parts, and that reflects also in the training when we bring a text like this, but instead of an ancient text, the visit that a student had providing spiritual care, we would read it like a script in the class to try to bring it alive and then be able to talk about it. So this is a story of Rabban Yochanan's disciples coming to comfort him after the devastating loss of deaths of one of his children. And as you'll see here, it was hard for them to come and provide care. So here we go. When Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's son died, his disciples came in to comfort him. Rabbi Eliezer entered, sat down before him, and said, "Rabbi, if you please, may I say something to you?" He responded, "Speak." He said to him, "Adam in the Torah had a son who died, yet he received comfort for the loss. How do we know that he was comforted for him? Because it is said in the Torah, and Adam knew his wife again. May you too be comforted." He, Rabban Yochanan, responded, "Is it not enough that I grieve for my own? Do you have to remind me of Adam's grief?" Rabbi Yehoshua entered and said, "Rabbi, if you please, may I say something to you?" He responded, "Speak." Job had sons and daughters, all of whom died in one day, and he was comforted for the loss of them. May you too be comforted. How do we know that Job was comforted? Because Job said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." He said to him, "Is it not enough that I grieve over my own? Do you have to remind me of Job's grief?" Rabbi Yossi entered, sat down before him, and said, "Rabbi, if you please, may I say something to you?" He responded, "Speak." He said, "Aaron had 2 sons, both of whom died in one day, yet he was comforted for the loss of them. As it is said, and Aaron was silent. His silence implies a willingness to be comforted. May you too be comforted." He said to him, "Is it not enough that I grieve for my own? Do you have to remind me of Aaron's grief?" Rabbi Shimon entered and said, "Rabbi, if you please, may I say something to you?" He responded, "Speak." He said to him, "King David had a son who died, yet he allowed himself to be comforted for the loss of him. How do we know that David was comforted? Because it is said, and David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and went to her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. which means from the word shalom, peace. May you too be comforted. He said to him, is it not enough I grieve for my own? Do you have to remind me of King David's grief? Rabbi Elazar ben Arach entered. As soon as Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he said to his aide, take my clothes and follow me to the bathhouse, for he is a great man. I shall be unable to withstand him. He entered and sat down before him and said, may I tell you a parable? To whom may you be likened? To a man with whom the king deposited an object. Each and every day the man would weep and cry out, saying, woe is me, when shall I be relieved of this trust? You too, Rabbi, had a son. He studied the Torah, the prophets, the writings. He studied Mishnah, Halakha, and Midrash, and departed from this world without sin. May you be comforted because you have returned unimpaired what was given in trust. He said to him, Elazar, my son, you have comforted me the way people should give comfort. So this is quite a extraordinary and intense text. And I often wonder what it would look like if it were staged, which is of course an option with a class to stage a presentation. But the first question often is, what was it about Rabbi Elazar's visit that was comforting? So one observation that's very apparent is that the first four used a formula. And he said something very personalized. And the first four, it wasn't personalized and it was formulaic. And they all had a sense of teaching, but that came out very differently. And that the personalization really spoke to Rabban Yochanan. So that is that is a first observation that we see in this text. We also see that there's a sense of, I would say, challenge to his grief, and even I'd say, like in this, we see grief and also like anger that comes out. And the first four have this yet, you should be, he like. Adam was bereaved, yet he was comforted. And so there's a certain devalidation of his feeling that doesn't come through with the final text. But then sometimes when I look at this text, I wonder, and I know others wonder too, like, was Rabbi Elazar's words actually something we would recommend? So again, we don't study this as a textbook, we don't study it for the purpose of this is what to do. But it is interesting to wonder, why was it comforting? It might not be comforting for everyone, but why was it? Some people I know find Rabbi Elazar's words also comforting, not comforting, well, not comforting specifically, because it's also imposing a certain sense of meaning. So what else could be a reason why Rabbi Elazar's words were comforting? So sometimes I wonder if it was timing, that sometimes during our emotional lives, and most definitely during our times of grieving, we feel differently on different days. And maybe by this fifth visit, Rabban Yochanan had expressed the anger he had to express, or he had cried out the way he wanted to cry out, and now he was able to receive comfort. It's interesting because it's different. It doesn't fully line up with this, but in the Jewish tradition, the period of time after a death before a burial called aninut, we're specifically instructed not to seek to comfort a person, kind of like there's a time to comfort and a time not to comfort. And so in this story, it also could raise a question of, was the person was just not there. It didn't mean the first four had failed, but the timing, person just takes time before they can receive comfort. So that's one possibility. Another possibility I see in this text is that it was the quality of a prior relationship. You might recall that earlier in the story, right, as Rabbi Elazar enters, before he says anything, says here, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach entered. As soon as Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he said to his aide, like, take me away. I won't be able to withstand it. Like, he's a great man. So there's some sense of knowledge. And of course, we know from other texts, relationship also. And so it's possible that based on the nature of their relationship at that time, that there was something in the relationship that he knew would move him. As an aside, I've often wondered exactly when he says to the aide, like, take my clothes and follow me to the bathhouse, is he trying to prepare himself to be comforted, or does he know that Rabbi Elazar will be comforting and he's not ready to be comforted, so he's actually trying to run away? So that's another question that we could ask in terms of what is it that that helps people be comforted? Is it what they say? Is it the timing of the visit? Is it the nature of the relationship? So I think also in this story, something that's very important to me also is the topic of meaning making and who does the meaning making, that often can be very important. So often when I study this, people, often are just like very aggravated at the first four people. We're going to come back to them in a few minutes. But I often try to glean from a text, what can I learn from every text? And what can I learn from their struggle? And in this case, what can I also learn about the comfort that they were seeking to bring? So I'd like to share a story, which also I have permission to share, as well as I've changed some details just to protect the privacy. I have a colleague, and she was asked to officiate at a funeral for a young adult who had died, as I said, as a young adult. And the father of this young adult was very well versed in Judaism, Jewish texts, and tradition. And as they prepared for this funeral, which of course would just be very, very heartbreaking situation, the father said to the rabbi, like, he kept interrupting the conversation, didn't Job lose children? When you write your eulogy, make sure to put Job in the eulogy. And then they would talk some more. And then the father would say, and Aaron also lost children. I want to make sure you put Aaron in the eulogy also. So basically this entire midrash, or these sources, manifest themselves in the eulogy. But what was so significantly different was that the connection with them and the meaning making with them came from the person themselves who was grieving, as opposed to the way these four came in and presented them, which again, maybe for some people would be comforting. In this case, that was not comforting. So maybe just to wrap up looking at this text, when we teach in our program at JTS, we'll sometimes start with the stories that the students experience themselves in their internships. And we'll sometimes start with a story like this story. And we bring them into conversation with one another to see what kind of insight our own lived experience sheds onto these texts, which helps us sometimes read them and understand them differently. And then we'll see what kind of insights come from the texts that might help us see our own lives, personal and professional, differently. And we really dwell in that space of conversation between texts and stories, ancient and current. So at this point, I'd like to pause and see if there's any comments or questions that we'd like to address before we continue.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Kalish. One, I think this is just in your kind of history of chaplaincy. Someone wanted to know, when did military chaplaincy become a thing? Was that a kind of constant, or is that?
Yeah, that is such a wonderful question. So military chaplaincy was the first institution of chaplaincy. I often like to say chaplaincies, especially because, as your question points out, there's different contexts. And military started first, and then afterwards, I'd say prison and hospital chaplaincy developed. And at this point, there's so many other kinds of locations for chaplaincy. University chaplaincy. We have several social service agencies, especially with elder care in our program. So we're placing students in social service agencies. I did a very unique type of chaplaincy service myself a year and a half ago when the trial took place for the Tree of Life
Mm.
trial, which they asked to have chaplains at the courthouse, which was I'd say cutting edge understanding, but also grew out of chaplains in police and fire and other kind of first responder situations. So it's a really wonderful history. But another part of the question, which I also think is interesting, is the religious diversification of the military chaplaincy. So in the United States, it's something like July 20th or 29th of 1776. So the Continental Congress authorized the development of chaplains to join in the Revolutionary War. And they developed the institution because the British had chaplains. So they kind of came with the British to the Americas. But it was all Protestant chaplains at that point. And it was under Abraham Lincoln that the first Jewish chaplain was commissioned for the United States military. And then World War II saw an expansion, World War I and then World War II. And now they just have a tremendous religious diversification at this point.
Well, that's what you want in any of these, like all of the situations that you just described are heightened, stressful, places in which you're not entirely sure about your direction. And there's some, and especially within the military, there's so many decisions that having someone who's in charge of your spiritual care seems like such an obvious, but also kind of impressive that was embedded even in a time before people were maybe as concerned about spiritual care and counseling.
Yeah, I'll maybe add another point also, which is after World War II, there was a significant expansion of 3 different professions. One was psychology, one was psychiatry, and the third was chaplaincy. And what happened is that the United States government and military greatly expanded all 3 of these professions during the war. And also in a military situation, and some other chaplaincies too, you don't necessarily get a chaplain who's your same faith tradition or your same denomination. And so it was often a time for both the chaplains and for the soldiers, a time of encountering people from different backgrounds. Sometimes, the first Catholic, the first Jew, etc., but also receiving a kind of humanistic counseling and support, what we call spiritual care that can really cross different. So when you need someone from the specific faith, then the ideal is to find someone, but that there's much that can be done just people to people around these questions of hope and meaning and coping with crisis. And this is something that makes actually American chaplaincy different from some other countries, which is that we've really developed this idea of what's called multifaith chaplaincy, which is, again, it's not syncretism. It's not making like Jews officiate at baptisms and, Catholics doing Jewish funerals. It's not that, but it's saying that there are elements of human connection that can happen across our differences.
I think, although I just stopped sharing, that we should probably continue on and we'll have more time for questions at the end.
Okay.
Of which there are more, but I just want to make sure we have time to get through knowing we are. So I'm going to reshare my screen now that I stopped sharing it. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, wonderful. So we can go to the next page. And so as I mentioned at the beginning, a core component of our program, especially in the internship component, is looking at the experience of the caregiver, or in this case, the chaplain intern, um, and creating a space for them to reflect on their own unique experience, what was meaningful to them, what was uplifting to them, also what was hard for them. And so here you see a couple paintings that we'll sometimes reference in thinking about and talking about. So, the painting on the left is by Edvard Munch, who's, more famous for the Scream. But he had an older sister die at a young age, I believe from tuberculosis. And this image of her in bed being visited, historically, people think it was by his aunt, who was one of the caregivers. This became a recurring image in his art. You could look this up, that over different times he's painted the same scene. Sometimes it has a more kind of edgy feel to it, and sometimes a calmer feel. But in this painting, what I'm struck by is that his sister here looks quite peaceful. She looks okay in this moment, in terms of her emotion. And the aunt, I can't quite tell what's happening with her. I can't tell if she's distressed herself, or her posture could be a prayer posture. So we could imagine, and we could discuss and debate how we interpret this painting. But what we do know is that the aunt is having her own experience. And so as chaplains, we care about the experience of the caregiver, and then we, by extension, also care about ourselves. And then here we also have Marc Chagall painting of imagining Abraham after Sarah died. And so what's interesting here also is the sense of solitude, like solitude in his grief. So as was mentioned before, we also bring into our conversation insights from different areas of the behavioral sciences or of psychology, and aspects of different theories of grief and grieving are very prevalent in our curriculum, as well as, on other topics we bring in other thinkers as well. And when I think about the caregiver and the care for the caregiver, I'm often thinking about disenfranchised grief, and that's part of what I want our students to develop their awareness of, is if the starting point is everyone's having an experience, to then also be curious about whose experience is being seen and heard and validated, and whose experience is not being seen, and how can we help address that. So that's part of the model that chaplains would bring to this work. Maybe we can scroll down just a tiny bit. There's also a concept that's very prevalent in chaplaincy and spiritual care called compassion fatigue. Sometimes it's associated with what's referred to as secondary traumatic stress, or secondary post-traumatic stress. And these are the terms that get used for the impact sometimes on the caregiver when they're exposed to distressing or traumatizing stories. So they don't even have to be necessarily privy to the initial traumatizing event, but that will draw on these theories as a way to help promote wellness and coping and resiliency in the profession. Chaplains and clergy often do score fairly high on when studies are done about a sense of purpose and meaning in their work. But leaders are people too, as we all know, and sometimes there are experiences of burnout, which is also a little different, but can be connected to these areas as well. So we'll work with the students sometimes to develop goals, as they go through their internship. What can they do that helps promote a sense of wellness in themselves? Okay, why don't we go to the next page? So there's a wonderful article several years ago in the Los Angeles Times that really popularized what's referred to as ring theory, that was developed by a clinical psychologist named Susan Silk and a colleague of hers who's a lawyer and arbitrator, Barry Goldman. And it's the idea that when there's a crisis or a situation, there are people who are more and people who are less affected, but all affected. And so you see this with the concentric circles, that at the very center would be the most affected person. But then you might have like immediate family or closest friends, or you might have school friends if it's a young person, or work colleagues, extended family, you know, synagogue or congregation, congregational community. So it goes, it goes from more intensely connected to less intensely connected. And what they say is, that everybody has an experience and everybody is deserving and worthy of care and actually should receive care. But the question is, how do you do that? So they developed a system in which in any encounter, one could ask themselves, like if they're talking with someone, am I more or less connected to the actual kind of core issue or core person who's most affected? If I'm less connected to the person I'm talking with, then my job is to comfort them. And if I'm talking with someone who's less affected than I am, so I'm more affected, then I can turn to that person and try to like lean on them. They call it dump out, but to be a recipient of care. I think this is a helpful model, and our students have really responded well to it because it really validates the fact that everyone has an experience. I do think like any model has its limitations, and I think sometimes relationships are a little more complex than this. Like it's not so clear cut who's closer in or who's farther out. And so maybe we also need to have some sense of reciprocation. It's not fully an either or, but that two people coming together can be mutually supportive of each other and take some turns. Maybe we'll skip over the next section and just go to the next page. But the point, there was a really wonderful study, some scholarship and reading of text that supports when we look at stories. So now I'm back to thinking about ancient stories. Sometimes it's helpful to look at what they call the supporting characters, and they do a little, the authors do a play on the word supporting, the characters who are not the main characters, so they're minor characters supporting in that sense. But they're also sometimes the characters who provide support. And so what can we learn from them? So I want to come back to our 5 visitors who came to visit Rabban Yochanan and to ask ourselves the question, what can we learn from each of them? And it's very interesting if we were to do a more in-depth analysis of what they each said. If we listen to each of them as, in a sense, not a supporting character, but like we put them at the center and the focus of our care. From Rabbi Eliezer, I'd hear this line, him referencing Adam and Adam knowing his wife again. And what I would learn about Rabbi Eliezer is that this story touched him. Rabbi Eliezer is watching his mentor and his colleague be in pain over this death. We also don't know if all of them knew the son who died, so they may all be grieving themselves. So here, what do I learn about Rabbi Eliezer in his own grief? And that's that that relationship and intimacy are very important to him. And Rabbi Yehoshua refers to Job, but specifically, like his example of Job being comforted is that he offered a prayer to God. And so what I learned about Rabbi Yehoshua is that God and theology, relationship with God and prayer are what comfort him. And for Rabbi Yossi, it says that Aaron was silent. And so from him, I learned that something about being silent, maybe meditation, mindfulness, that these are what he finds comforting. Rabbi Shimon refers to David, and also this demonstrating some comfort through intimacy and relationship that is with his wife again. And here it's a little different because she bears a child, and so something about children and legacy seemed to be important to him. And then Rebbe Elazar seems to find comfort in the personalization, and that's what he presents. So we learned something about each of them. And that's what we're also trying to do in our class. We learn about what gives each of us comfort. And then the next question in the art of spiritual caregiving is to be aware of that so that we can share it when it seems like it's also comforting to the person we're caring for, but that we're also careful not to impose it on someone when they might have a different way of coping. So here, in a sense, this midrash gives us a variety of different ways that people cope and are comforted, and we could ask ourselves, to what extent is this comforting? Something else I often think about that comes from grief and bereavement theory and some practices, methodologies, is the question also of when is it helpful to hear about someone else's story? So sometimes in after a loss, sometimes a person's advised to sometimes we people want to focus on the uniqueness of our own situation, and having some sort of one-to-one, either conversations with our clergy or therapy or bereavement counseling, that's what's most comforting because it honors the uniqueness of our story. And then at a certain point, sometimes people find it comforting to be in a bereavement group, because that's what's comforting, is to hear, like, okay, it's not exactly the same, but other people know a little bit about what I'm going through from their own experience. So I think also what happened in this midrash is that these five found it helpful to make an association with someone else the way like a support group would. And Rabban Yochanan, who you might recall, like lashed out, like, what, is it not enough I grieve for my own, and you also want me to grieve for these others? He wasn't ready yet to, in a sense, like open his heart to other grieving, because for his healing, he needed to focus on himself. I think we're not going to look at Job, but I know Job is very, kind of more commonly known, but really wonderful examples of looking at the friends who comfort. And we have this wonderful example where they really comfort him. And then we have examples where they talk a lot and challenge what Job has said. And so it's a really rich text for looking at how do we understand why people do that, why they would challenge a person in their time of difficulty. So I'm gonna just conclude there, and I know we have a few more questions, and so let's shift to those.
Great. I think, well, one of our questions has to do with just kind of text study in general. Like, this is you are giving kind of both a Jewish approach, but this also is kind of a secular engagement with text. And they're wondering the questioner was interested in, they feel like kind of an orthodox religious approach has been particularly captivating to younger professionals, and that this seems like this is a really great balancing act. How do we get that out into the universe? And why do you think this kind of more religiously engaged text study approach is more popular, or maybe it's not? You go from there.
That's a really great question, and please follow up if I don't fully answer, if I didn't fully catch the nuance of it. I'll share just an interesting story, which is a few years ago, I was teaching this text in a class, and one of the students who was doing the spiritual care as well as a rabbinical student, she said, "This is amazing. I just studied this text last semester with Rabbi Bert Vysotsky, who's a professor of Midrash at JTS. And she said, and so she said that she studied it with him, and they had this really wonderful exchange where she was giving like a chaplain's kind of interpretation, kind of like what I did. And he brought in other historical and literary ways that would really reflect the like academic study of text. And so I think, I think different people find different approaches to text um, meaningful, and I do think it's something that there's really wonderful opportunity at JTS for when putting things into into historical context and seeing what we learn. That can be very meaningful. From my perspective, um, it's very important that we base our spiritual care in our faith and religious texts, that it's not all psychology, because if it was all psychology, then why don't we become psychologists? Like that there is something that the fields of medicine and psychology like can contribute. There's something like this perspective can contribute also. And when we do study the texts this way, we are largely taking them out of their historical context. But I think that's okay. It's all about what's the application. And I guess, the question also was wondering about young people. I think it's about a search for rootedness and meaning, but that it doesn't have to be either or. But I think when we engage text, we do want to be always thinking that people, we human beings seek meaning in our lives, and that's part of why we're engaging the texts.
So this is, we're talking about the Master's in Spiritual Care and Counseling. This is an interfaith program, but it is also rooted in Jewish tradition and text. So what would you say? Do you feel like there's a difference between getting a degree through JTS in terms of spiritual care and counseling, or through Union Seminary or a Christian seminary or organization, or Islamic, or if there non-affiliated chaplaincy programs?
Yeah, I do think there will be some overlap, but this is the core question. So whoever asked this is a question I constantly need to make sure I can articulate, because why do it if we can't articulate it? I think what we see here is that we approach diversity and we engage, our program. Our program has instructors, students, and what we call like care recipients from diverse backgrounds. It looks a little differently if it's the clients at the institute, the clinical site, or the faculty, or the students, and which part, but we have people coming from all over New York City as well as beyond New York City. But what we find here at JTS is a curriculum that's informed out of the Jewish experience. So we might not be teaching Judaism we'll have options for people who want a foundation in Judaism, but very much our experience as a minority religion in the United States informs a sensitivity towards minority religions in the United States. My experience is that sometimes, before I was mentioning about some of the most human experiences, and I was saying like illness and bereavement, like these are among the things we can call universal. Sometimes it happens that statements will be understood of what's universal, but it actually reflects a certain majority culture perspective. And so I think, it's our job to think about caring for everyone, including people in the majority, but our curriculum helps us discern some of that a little bit more in terms of what's the what we could call the bias of the curriculum.
So as we're wrapping up here today, just, one nuts and bolts question. If people were interested in getting a master's in spiritual care and counseling, what would they do? What's how long does it take? When does the next cohort start? Any of those kinds of practical questions.
Yeah, so the website has information, and I wonder if it's possible to put the link in the...
Oh, it's been shared several times.
Shared. Oh, okay, great.
Yes, we're very, Aiden has done a great job of getting that.
That's fantastic.
But we can share it once more.
Yeah, so the program can be done in person for the most part at the New York campus at 3080 Broadway, or it can be done almost fully online. We will be integrating more more of a low residency or flexible residency in which people come for a week once or twice a year. But besides that, we have people from all over the country taking the program, and we've had people in other countries also sometimes enrolling in different parts. So people can begin the program in a fall entry or a spring entry, so September or January. There's that
So flexible.
flexibility. Yeah, and typically people tend to take 1 or 2 classes a semester. And then there are 6 academic courses, so 6 3-credit courses. And then there's 2 of these supervised internships. And the internships are 400 hours that either need to be a full-time summer program, or they can be a part-time program during the academic year. We can give more if you have interest. We can schedule a time to talk and give you more information. But all told, a person could do this in 15 months as the shortest length of time, or it can be spread out to like 2 or 3 years part-time. And we try to work, knowing try to schedule things, knowing that people often have other obligations, either work or other commitments or family commitments.
Well, this has been so delightful. And I think it is really one of these things that we all are in these spaces where we walk into a room and you're like, what am I supposed to say to this person?
Yeah.
And so seeing this kind of framing and just that this is not a new problem. We're all challenged by this at all different times. And that the way we can take this in, whether we want to be chaplains or not, that we all become chaplains in some way in our lives. And so I've really appreciated the learning and teaching. And thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thanks.
Next week, we are off because it is President's Day. So, go buy a mattress. And the week after that, we will pick back up with Rabbi Stephanie Risquet and Dr. Phil Kiesman talking about 2 new fellowships we have for teens. So while this was really directed towards, people who are already kind of advanced in their learning, our next session, which was on the 24th, will be really geared towards thinking about how we're setting up our next generation of learners. Thanks, Rabbi Kalish, so much for your teaching, and we look forward to seeing you all again.